This is the first of a series of 3 lessons related to introducing one of the major areas of mathematics, which is trigonometry. In this particular lesson, we're going to be focusing on labeling the sides of a right triangle. More specifically, in this lesson, first, you will be able to define what trigonometry is. Second, you'll be able to label the 3 sides of a right triangle. And third, you'll be able to define the ratios of sine, cosine, and tangent. But first, before we really can get into trigonometry, we need to have a basic understanding of what trigonometry actually is. And all trigonometry is the study of how different sides and angles of a triangle are related to each other. And in trigonometry, we're going to be focusing on 3 of these major relationships, or ratios. And another important fact to understand that everything we're talking about today focuses on right triangles. And right triangles are simply triangles that only have a right angle. So in this case, down in the bottom right corner, we know that this is a right triangle since it has a 90-degree angle. So remember, everything we're doing today focuses on right triangles. Our first step is in being able to do these trigonometry ratios and having an understanding of how these relationships work is that we need to label the 3 sides of the right triangle. And before we can do that, we need to start off by picking one of the angles where all of our relationships are going to be focused from. In our particular example today, we're going to focus on angle A. So if they asked you for the relationships between angle B, you would start at angle B instead. But for our example, we're going to focus on labeling the 3 sides in relation to angle A. So our first step is we want to label the opposite side. So to label the opposite side, you start off at your angle, which is angle A, right up here in the top right corner of the triangle. And you draw your arrow straight across. And that arrow will be pointing at your opposite side. So we've just labeled side little a as the opposite side, since it's the side that is pointing across from our angle we're looking at, in this case, angle A. Once you've got the opposite side labeled, let's label the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is always the side labeled across from your right angle, which in this case is angle C. So start at your angle and draw an arrow straight across. So the blue arrow is pointing at your hypotenuse, side C. And remember, the hypotenuse is always the side across from your right angle. And it's also the longest side in the right triangle. So that's an easy way for you to check to see if you have the correct side labeled. And last, the third side remaining is simply your adjacent side. So we now have our 3 sides labeled in this particular right triangle. Side little a is your opposite side, side little b is your adjacent side, and side C is your hypotenuse. And once you have all 3 sides of the right triangle labeled, we can actually use that to figure out some more important relationships related to these 3 sides. And these relationships come in the form of what we call trigonometry ratios. In particular, there's 3 major ones. Sine, which is shorthandedly labeled as SIN, cosine, which is shorthandedly named as COS, and tangent, which is TAN. And these 3 different trig ratios relate the lengths of 2 of the 3 sides of the triangle. So the sine of A is always the length of your opposite side, which in this case is little a, over the measure of your hypotenuse, which is little c. So the sine, again, of angle A is little a over c. The cosine of A is always given as the length of the adjacent side divided by the hypotenuse. So in this case, it's the length of little b divided by little c. And the final ratio, tangent, is always given as the length of the opposite side, in this case little a, over the length of the adjacent side, which is little b. So having an understanding of sine, cosine, and tangent will allow us to find many more interesting features of the right triangle. And there's an easy way to remember these three trig ratios and an easy way to memorize them. And that's through understanding the acronym of SOHCAHTOA. And all SOHCAHTOA simply is the first letters of each of the three ratios and the first letter of the two sides that the ratio represents. So for example, the SOH part represents sine is opposite over hypotenuse. Sine starts with S, opposite starts with O, and hypotenuse starts with H. So SOH. Cosine, same idea, adjacent divided by the hypotenuse, C, A, and H. And last but not least, your tangent is always the opposite over the hypotenuse. So looking at those first three letters, it's TOA, excuse me. So, now that you know the three different trig ratios, we can actually use this to find some more interesting information. Let's say we've got a triangle like this one, where we have all three of the lengths known. We know that the side AB down here is 3, BC is 4, and AC is 5. And the question's asking us to find the sine of A, the cosine of A, and the tangent of A. So we now know how to label the three sides of a right triangle, and we also know what the trig ratios are. So let's follow those two steps to be able to figure out the three different trig ratios. So our first step is we need to label the three sides of our triangle. So start off at the angle they're asking for, in this case A. And you draw an arrow straight across from that angle. The arrow in blue represents this first drawing, and it is always pointing at your opposite side of the triangle. So the side with length 4 is your opposite side, and that's the first step. Our second step to label the sides is you go to your right angle, which in this case is angle B, and draw another arrow straight across. And it's pointing at the side AC with the length of 5. So the arrow in green is pointing at your hypotenuse. And the last side left over, AB, the 3, is simply your adjacent side. So we now have all three sides of our triangle labeled. The opposite side is 4, the adjacent side is 3, and the hypotenuse is 5. Whenever you're solving for the trig ratios, I highly recommend you first label all three sides first, as it takes all of the guesswork out of solving the problems. And now that we've got our three sides labeled, all we have to do is go back to the three ratios that we know. We know that the sine is the length of the opposite side divided by the hypotenuse. So, in this case, our opposite side was 4, and the hypotenuse was 5. So the sine of A is equal to 4/5, or 4 divided by 5. The cosine of A is the adjacent side divided by the hypotenuse. So 3 divided by 5. And lastly, the tangent of A is the opposite divided by the adjacent. Our opposite side is 4, and the adjacent side is 3. So the tangent of A is equal to 4/3. So we have now, using the fact that we had our right triangle labeled, we now are able to find the sine, cosine, and tangent by just using what each ratio was defined as, and taking the lengths of those sides and simply plugging them in. So we have just found the sine of A, the cosine of A, and the tangent of A for this particular right triangle. And the last main point I want to bring up is that, remember, these three ratios only work for right triangles. If you have a triangle without a right angle, you're going to have to use some of the other formulas that we'll talk about in future lessons. So these three methods for sine, cosine, and tangent only work for triangles that have one right angle, a 90-degree one. So in this case, we can use it for triangles like the one here on the left, but this one here on the right that's been crossed out, we can't use it for. And this is the conclusion of our first lesson on trigonometry.